Let me turn to the third link in the chain, and that is, if you like, managing the local, managing the physical process of resource extraction. And the Prime Minister spoke here about this, about the opportunities for local benefit from the resource extraction activities by ancillary supply activities. So let me add to what you suggested there, which is that one of the big potential benefits is from the transport that resource extraction needs. Resource extraction quite often requires railways to get the minerals to the coast. And potentially those railways, if they can be made to be multi-user and multifunction, can really open up whole areas of land. And I stress this double feature, multi-user, multifunction. By multi-user, I mean that more than one resource extraction company should be able to use the same railway. Resource extraction companies hate this. What they want is the first resource extraction company to get a prospect wants to build the railway and have exclusive control of it. Why do they want exclusive control? Because then all the other resources that are going to be discovered round and about, basically, they've got a monopoly, because no other resource extraction company wants to be dependent upon them. So multi-user and multifunction, this stuff should be transporting agricultural produce as well as minerals. Again, the mining companies hate that. They say, oh, it's such a nuisance. I talked with the director of strategy of one of the biggest resource extraction companies in the world, and his starting position was, oh, it's a terrible nuisance. We can't be bothered. It interferes with transporting the ore. But he wanted to see me because he had got a political problem. And his political problem was, he says, the next generation of resource extraction, the technology is so capital intensive, it won't generate any jobs at all. And so where is our constituency, political constituency of support in a country if we're not generating any jobs? So I said to him, well, actually, if you allowed multifunction, if you allowed the rail to open up agriculture, you'd have a constituency of support, because agriculture employs a lot of people. Right? After 3 hours, he'd actually changed his mind. He decided that mining extraction could manage multifunction railways. Right? So to my mind, the right solution for railways, where possible, is to get independent operators, independent of any particular mining company, properly regulated, and with an incentive to actually do multifunction. I wrote all that up in the International Monetary Fund has a magazine called Finance and Development, and in the last issue I've got a feature called Building an African Infrastructure, which just sets that out. So I'll leave you with a copy, but it is online, the IMF's Finance and Development, and my paper in that. That's a matter of trying to get some benefits, but there's also, let's look at the environmental costs. And the nightmare that any African government should have seared into its mind is the Niger Delta. You know, at all costs, avoid the Niger Delta. The Niger Delta is now such a deep problem, so intractable, that it may well be insoluble. There's two things to balance here. One is that the local community needs to have rights to full and generous compensation for any environmental damage, and that environmental damage needs to be kept to a minimum. And so the company needs to have be in an incentive framework where it has an incentive to minimize damage. Think of the big difference between the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico and the many oil spills in West Africa. And the big difference is not the scale of the oil spills, it's the legal framework in which those spills occurred. British Petroleum in the Gulf of Mexico, the first action they did upon that spill was to commit to spend $500 million on independent studies of the costs to local people of that spill. $500 million just on independent studies of the costs to local people. Why did they want to spend so much money just on independent studies of the costs? Because they knew that once it got to the courts in America, the best they could hope for was to keep the cost to BP down to objectively assessed true damage to people. And then you contrast that with what happened in West Africa, where any compensation was voluntary. And so building a structure in which local people can get proper compensation and be confident that they can get proper compensation and be confident that the damage will be kept to a minimum. Now, if you don't do that, sorry, there's one other thing, that local people must be assured that they will fully benefit in the benefits that accrue to everybody. And those benefits need to be transparent and, again, credible. It's no good promising one thing and nothing happening. Recognize that citizens are suspicious. If you don't do that, what you end up with is the Niger Delta. And the Niger Delta is not just a discourse of violence, it's a discourse of exaggerated rights. The local population in the Niger Delta are saying, this is our oil. And they're wrong. Nigeria's oil should benefit all Nigeria's citizens. The last thing you want in Tanzania is for some lucky locals to find themselves sitting on top of a gold mine and say, it's all ours. You know? These natural resources, it's random where they are. At the moment you don't know where a lot of them are. You want to get all citizens equally benefiting. But for that you have to deal with the legitimate rights of the locals. So that's dealing with the locals. And now there's two links in the chain left, and they are the two most important links, I think. And they're the two that the Prime Minister didn't mention. So I'm particularly keen to, this is where I hope there's going to be some value added in what I say over what the Prime Minister said. So if we've managed the first three links, we've discovered our natural resources, we've dealt with the local, and we've captured a lot of revenues for the government. Right? Those are the first three links. We've got a well-functioning tax system, the local population is happy, and we've got masses of discoveries. And now what? Revenues are coming into the government. What do we do with them? And so link number 4 is the decision about the balance between consumption and the future. I'm going to call the future savings, but it's going to include investment. So it's consumption versus savings and investment. This is referring to that second form of plunder, whether the present generation expropriates what should benefit future generations. And that balance is really important to get right. What you need to recognize is that these revenues are fundamentally unsustainable. You're depleting a set of natural resources. At some stage, they're going to run out physically. Even before they run out physically, their price might decline. Their price might collapse. I mean, look at what's happened to world supplies of gas. You just got a big discovery of gas, but look what's happened to gas discoveries in America, and look what's happened to the gas price in America. Right? Gas price in America has collapsed because of huge discoveries. These prices are deeply unpredictable. We know that in the long term, technology moves on and resources become obsolescent. The big resource of the 19th century was nitrates. And the world's moved on. So count upon, I would say, sort of maybe 2 or 3 decades of high-value natural resource extraction, but don't think it's permanent. And then think, so during this next 3 decades, 2 or 3 decades, we're going to have big unsustainable revenues. And a fair proportion of those revenues need to be saved. There are actually going to be two different reasons for savings. One is just riding the tiger of volatility of commodity prices. And I'll park that for the moment. That's just smoothing the ups and the downs. But the one I want to focus on for the moment is the slow clock ticking of resource depletion. Over the course of 2 or 3 decades, you run out of these things. I remember a Zambian friend saying to me, what are our children going to say about us when we've run out of copper? And the Zambians have a point there, because the Finnish ambassador was previously ambassador to Zambia, and she might share with you over lunch or whatever. The Zambians haven't done a great job of investing in the future. Very far from it. So you need to have a distinct savings policy from these revenues from natural resources, distinct from all your other revenues. First thing is just separate them out in the budget. Say, here's the revenues from sustainable resources, here's the revenues from resource depletion. 2 different revenue streams, 2 different saving streams. The saving stream out of the unsustainable revenues needs to be higher. How high? Well, in the end, that's up to you. I would say less than 30% savings rate out of unsustainable revenues is not really respecting your obligations to the future. After all, if we look at Asia, on average, savings rates in Asia are well above 30%, and the revenues are all sustainable. They're not even running down natural assets. So savings rates of less than 30% from natural resources, I think, are just too low. Your savings rate over the last few years has tended to be about 20%. So I just think for the new revenues from natural resources, you need a higher savings rate. Start it at around 30%, and then as the resources deplete, that savings rate needs to rise. It'll fall over, just get that. So start it at 30% and gradually you push that savings rate up. So that's the savings to counter depletion, and that's the slow clock of resource depletion. Then there's another policy clock, which is the erratic tick of riding the tiger of commodity prices. Sometimes prices are high, sometimes they're low. You've lived through that. You've lived through coffee booms, oil shocks. There's a nightmare. Look at the gold price. You're a gold exporter. Just look at the range of the gold price over the last few years. These are deeply unpredictable. And the answer is you need some sort of smoothing device, because you cannot afford to have revenues going up and down like a yo-yo. Sorry, you can't afford to have expenditures going up and down like a yo-yo. Revenues are going to go up and down, but expenditures better be smoothed. So you need some policy rule for saving in the good times into a pot of money which you can deplete in the bad times. But that's a separate business from the slow clock of resource depletion. So much for link 4, which is saving strategies. And just to summarize that, we've got two policy clocks on our dial now. The slow tick of resource depletion, which says we'd better have substantial savings rates out of natural resources, and the erratic clock of commodity prices, which will sometimes say times are good, we better save, and sometimes times are bad, let's run down that savings pot. The final link in the chain. The final link in the chain. What do you do with those savings? What do you use them for? Now, there's one very influential model here, which is the Norwegian model. And there's a representative from Norway here. I've worked very closely with the Norwegian government over the years, and they are an absolute model. They are the most successful resource management country in the world. But the message to you, which I think they'll give you as well, is that you should not copy their model of what to do with the accumulated savings. What Norway now does with the accumulated savings is park the money abroad in financial assets. Effectively, it's a sovereign wealth fund. Why does it make sense for Norway to do that and not for you? And the answer is the basic economics is different. Norway literally has more invested capital per member of the labor force than any other country in the world. It is the most capital-rich country in the world. And so adding further to the Norwegian capital stock would not be very productive. It makes much more sense for Norwegians to buy capital in Brazil or China, which is what they're doing. The capital they own in Brazil will be more productive than if they added to the enormous capital stock in Norway. And you are at the opposite end of the spectrum. You have less capital per member of the labor force than almost any country in the world. And so for you, the long-term task is to use those savings to build up the capital stock in Tanzania. That is a very fundamental difference. That's why you shouldn't be doing a sovereign wealth fund. You do need a sovereign fund, but those funds should be free to be either put abroad or invested domestically. So I prefer to call that a sovereign development fund. And now the killer. Investment is always particular, and it's always dependent upon a process of investing. One reason why Tanzania and more generally African countries have very little investment, very little capital, is that they haven't built the capacity to invest well. And so it's quite possible to spend a lot on investment and have very little to show for it. This is actually what Nigeria did. It had great big expenditures which bought practically nothing. And so the key step in harnessing natural resources for prosperity is to build that capacity to invest well. And I call that investing in investing. Investing in investing. Now that itself takes time. And this is the third policy clock. So one policy clock is the slow tick of resource depletion. The second policy clock is the erratic tick of commodity prices. And the third policy clock is the gradual process of building the capacity to invest well, investing in investing. Until you built that capacity, there's no point in trying to spend a lot of money on investment. You'll waste it. And so the right thing to do is to save abroad. But then as you build the capacity to invest productively at home, you bring that money back. Now, how do you build domestic capacity to invest? There's public capital, private capital, public investment, private investment, and then something that's common to both. Let me say a few words about each. The public investment process. There's a new IMF measure. I'm an advisor to the IMF, and I advise them to build a measure of the capacity for public investment country by country, and they've done it. Right? The new IMF is a great improvement on the old IMF, just like the new Kilimanjaro Hotel is a great improvement on the old one, right? And the index, which you can just Google online and it'll pop up in 3 seconds, is called the Public Investment Management Index. Public Investment Management Index, IMF. And before I came, I did just that. I did Public Investment Management Index, IMF, Tanzania. And out you popped, right? And it doesn't look very good. Right? What I learned from that is that you have got you've got a lot of capacity building to do here before you have big investment. So save, for the moment, save it abroad, a lot of it, and big effort on building the public investment management process, especially project selection and project implementation procedures. Really vitally important. If you don't build those, you'll just repeat Nigeria's mistake of saving its resource revenues, trying to invest them, and having nothing to show for it. That's public investment. Public investment and private investment are complements. Huh? Think roads and vehicles. The private sector provides the vehicles, the public sector provides the roads. The return on the roads depends upon the investment in the vehicles and vice versa. The private investment climate, you don't control directly, but you do indirectly through policies. And again, a useful benchmark there is the doing business surveys. It's not perfect, right? It can be gamed, but it's better than nothing, right? And it comes out each year so you can see whether you're going up or going down. Again, I just Googled doing business, Tanzania, you're 122nd at the moment. Right? On Sunday I'll be in Kigali, they're 60th. Right? 7 years ago, Kigali, Rwanda was 140th. They moved up from 140th to 60th just by, in that case, the president saying to his ministers, you're responsible for this bit, you're responsible for this bit, come back next year with a better performance, or. That worked. So these things are worth doing. The indices are not magic in themselves, but it's just like a doctor taking your pulse. It's handy to have some sort of measure of how you're doing. And then there's a final component to investment and investment. There's the public investment, there's the private investment. Both public and private investment have to buy capital goods. And capital goods come as equipment and structures. The structures, the capital goods can be imported, the equipment can be imported, but the structures have to be built. And the cost of structures depends upon the unit costs of construction, depends upon your construction industry. Right? And East Africa at the moment has high unit costs of construction. Just look at your cement industry, 35% common external tariff on cement, I think. I think you might have brought it down a bit, actually. But that means your structures are just going to cost a lot more than equivalent structures elsewhere in the world. And that means you can spend a lot on capital investment and not buy much for it. You just get less structure for your money. So trying to focus on bringing down those costs of construction are the final component of investing and investing. Now, there's the decision chain. That's a long chain, right? You discovery, you tax, you deal with the local, you save a sensible proportion of the revenues, and you build the capacity to use that savings for productive investment in the country. That's the decision chain you have to get right, and it's not something that has to be got right once, it has to be got right every time, at least for a generation. We're talking about a generation. The coming generation is the resource-rich generation. Your generation has the responsibility for depleting Tanzania's inheritance of natural assets and using the proceeds responsibly. And that's the decision chain you have to get right. Now, a final question is, how do you get it right? How do you reliably get that decision chain right? Not just once, but every time for a generation. And this is where we end on the politics. What are the politics of getting it right? And especially bearing in mind this terrible history of the resource curse. The default option is that you are going to repeat other people's history. Right? That's what you're staring at, the likelihood of repeating other people's history. You will have the biggest missed opportunity on your hands that Tanzania will ever have had. So how do we avoid that? Now, the good news is that a bad history does not have to be repeated. People can learn from it instead of repeating it. And let me give you a dramatic example, right? Which is so dramatic that people don't recognize it, actually. So let me pose the following question to you. What is the best managed economy in Europe today? Finland's not allowed to vote. It's not Finland. Finland is well managed, but it's not. The answer is not Finland. The best managed major economy in Europe today. Any bidders? Yeah. Yes. I mean, Germany, right? Not Britain. Germany. Obviously. Now the important question: why is Germany the best managed economy in Europe? And here's the answer. The political answer. Because it used to be the worst. Because it used to be the worst. You go back 3 generations, Germany was the one European society to mess up so disastrously that it went into hyperinflation. No other European society messed up so badly. Germans came out of hyperinflation with the searing sense, never again. Without legal rules, it's very hard to make progress, but rules themselves are not enough. Because, believe it or not, sometimes rules get ignored. Right? Let me tell you a story from yesterday. The IMF was making a presentation in Arusha yesterday on the Eurozone and the euro. And they put up a list of the 2 rules of the Eurozone. Right? There's only 2 rules in the Eurozone that countries had to follow. There's 17 countries. 16 of those 17 countries broke the rules. Very honorably, there's only one country that didn't break all the rules, and that was Finland, which is why Finland's going to have to pay for everybody else. there's a demonstration that just passing rules is not enough, right? The Eurozone passed the rules, and then they all broke them. Right? If the Eurozone breaks, the first country to break the rules in the Eurozone was Germany, actually, you know? So rules are the place to start, but they're not the place to stop. Right? The next challenge is to make those rules for real. There's two things you do to make the rules for real. One is, and this is what the Germans did with fighting hyperinflation, one is they built a dedicated institution whose job was to enforce the rules. That was the independent central bank. Your task is different. It's not fighting inflation. It's preventing this plunder of natural resources. But you need dedicated institutions to enforce good decisions along that decision chain. Dedicated institutions will help because if you depart from good decisions, their job is to blow the whistle. But blowing the whistle isn't enough unless there are people to hear the whistle. And that's the third thing that the Germans managed to do, and why they've still completely free of inflation, and that is they built a critical mass of citizens who understood why the rules mattered, why the institutions mattered, and have defended them ever since. And that's the triad you need: rules, dedicated institutions, and a critical mass of citizens who understand what the issues are. Now, it's entirely possible in Tanzania to build a critical mass of citizens who understand the opportunity posed by depleting resources and who understand the dangers of plunder. You know, the days of a passive citizenry in Africa are over. But still, that citizenry has to be informed. It's easy to end up with a citizenry that is so suspicious that it condemns everything. And that's what's happened in Nigeria now. They've got a citizenry which is so contemptuous of government that no matter what government does, there's protest, even when government does things that are sensible. So building a critical mass of informed citizens is a vital part, and it's something which is something that government needs to do. So there's the decision chain, there's the history of plunder, and there's my humble suggestions for how to avoid repeating history. I can only say, sir, in closing, that this is the most important struggle that Tanzania will have over the next decade, and it's a privilege to be in a room with people who are responsible for handling that decision. Like all professors, I write books. You were kind enough, sir, to mention the bottom billion, the sequel, which explores in detail that natural resource chapter, is The Plundered Planet. So in a moment, I'll be giving you a copy of that, and that goes through in detail what I've said just now. There's one other thing that I draw your attention to, and which is really for everybody, and that is this. It's the Natural Resource Charter. You've already signed up to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is about transparency. The Natural Resource Charter is about the full decision chain. It's the minimum chain of decisions you need to harness natural resources. It's a set of principles. The Natural Resource Charter is now adopted by NEPAD as a flagship program of NEPAD. And NEPAD is looking for lead countries to promote the Natural Resource Charter. And so I would encourage Tanzania to be in the forefront of the Natural Resource Charter. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, Claire Short, who runs it, recommends this as the natural next step beyond the EITI. The Natural Resource Charter is an independent initiative chaired by Ernesto Zedillo, who is the former president of Mexico. Ernesto Zedillo said, "I saw oil destroy Mexico, and I don't want that to happen elsewhere." And so he is chairing this process. It's supported by a large consortium of donors, in the forefront of which is the government of Norway. So I recommend this to your attention. I brought a few copies, so I will give one to you, sir. But you can also just Google Natural Resource Charter, and it all pops up. So with that, thank you very much. So I'm sorry I've gone on for so long.